Hi, my name is Scott Miller. Welcome to my Top Performance blog. I have the honor today of speaking with psychologist Jimmu Muecke, who works out of it's Sydney, Australia, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
And I'm really grateful that you would spend a few minutes with me talking today about deliberate practice. I must say before we start that usually my office doesn't look like this. The shelves are barren. I've got packing crates here off the left-hand side, and the reason is we're moving house, and I won't be in this spot for a lot longer, but you were kind enough when I reached out to you and said, "Hey, Jimmy, would you talk with me about your work?" You said, "Sure thing." And we just had to figure out the time zones and we were off to the races. So I think what really interested me about what you've been writing, and you can find what Jimmy's experience has been with deliberate practice by typing in deliberatepracticepsych.com. It'll scroll right along the bottom here, and you're going to see a series of blogs about your experience with DP. And what I really appreciated, Jimmy, was your sharing while you were in the process, right from the start, and the experiences that you've had. Because I have found personally, everybody likes the idea of DP in principle. It has a kind of common sense appeal. Yeah, you're going to practice this. I'm going to get better at it. Yay, what could be bad about this? And what I think happens is most people discover the reality and the dream are kind of two different things.
For sure. For sure. Absolutely.
So I guess what I really want to start with is what got you started with DP? How did you hear about it? And what just made you decide to pick it up and run with it?
So I got into it through my mentor as I was coming through the last stages of my psychology training. He was very, very familiar with your work. I think he'd even been to at least a couple of your fit trainings in Chicago. So often when we would have supervision, he was always trying to mention what he'd been doing with you and fit in particular. He was very big on fit. So he got me in through that. The funny thing was, as I think a lot of people would experience in trying out with the SRS initially to get into fit, I was too scared. Just the
Huh.
feedback, the idea of feedback was just too daunting. So I would go through and do the scales with clients at the end of the session. But even if it showed like a reduction in the scores compared to a previous session, I would just want to sidestep it, right?
This is so
So
much what I really appreciate about your posts that you've been doing, both about DP and then measurement based care as well. You have such honesty about the experience. I don't know many people would say, "Hey, doing that SRS thing, frankly, scares the shit out of me." You know, I'm not sure I want to get the feedback. And anyway, once people start to click, if they haven't seen your blog posts already, I think that honesty, that transparency really comes. That's a great trait, Jimmy.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I think it's really important that people see the rawness of the experience, right? To
Mm.
see that you can go through all that, you can go through all that vulnerability and still get through to the other side, I
Mm.
think is really, really crucial. So it's something that I always am willing to share.
So your mentor, he introduced you to fit, which of
Mhm.
course is a core aspect or part of deliberate practice. And you've been doing deliberate practice and measurement for how long now?
So BP started up, it would have been around March 2021, because I know better results came out in 2020 and I was a little slow onto it. So as soon as I picked it up around that time in 2021, yeah, I jumped into getting more solid in using the SRS and it went from there. So it's really been, what, 2.5 years or so at this point.
Okay, and you're still at it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The whole time, haven't dropped it. Yeah,
And
it's fairly consistent.
if you had to put your finger on one realization that you've had throughout this entire 2.5 year process, and I will say again, my experience is most people hear about DP, they may download the measures and begin measuring. They will buy a book, but then they start to get into it and I have some other stuff to do, my progress notes, oh, my kids need to be taken care of. So what's been your biggest realization to date about this process?
Biggest thing is that DP has taught me to address my fight versus flight response myself in sessions. because it taught me that I tend to react to a client's own fight versus flight reaction when it comes up in sessions by either avoiding the subject or trying too hard and overcompensating to work them through it and problem solving. So in applying DP, what I found is that it was actually helping to address better outcomes with clients in those situations, because I know it almost feels like a cliche story because I've been writing about it for so long. But I remember around the time that I started reading the Better Results book, I did a beginner's course online in ACT therapy, and my outcomes with clients didn't increase at all through that time. As I started going through the DP journey, addressing that fight versus flight response more and more, my stats have gradually increased, just gradually, slowly over time, but they're getting there. It's very consistent. So it works.
So it was the outcome focus that kept you going. You
For
tried
sure.
one thing, it didn't make much of a difference, and you started doing the DP, and in particular focused on something that was should I call it a sore spot or a weakness or
For sure. Yeah, you could absolutely call it that. Yeah, I think that because it's more often that I end up trying too hard and over explaining. So it's almost just like this automation that I get into, and it would be very hard to get out of.
okay. And have there been times along this 2.5 year path where you thought, that's it, I'm giving up?
For sure, for sure. I think with that, because the fight versus flight response is so ingrained in our brain, it's been a very slow process to massage it and work through it. So there was definitely points where it's like, I've had enough, because I would try this, try that, even from a DP point of view, just trying different ways of going about addressing it, just this trial and error. And it would be like 6 months sometimes. And it hasn't really shifted in terms of my experience of it, at least. You just get to the points where you just be fed up. But I think it was just that trial and error mentality and leaning on my values, like perseverance for one thing in particular, and patience as well, and just keeping at it. And then eventually it would start to break down.
Your
Yeah.
experience, I've heard from others as well, that it would be so much easier if somebody would say, hey, Jimmy, just repeat this thing over and over and over again, and your
Mm.
outcomes will improve. But that has
Mhm.
not been your experience. You're talking
Mhm.
about loads of trial and error. Could you say anything more about that?
Yeah, because I've tried the just repeating things over and over. I'd even get into that corner myself through the DP process because my brain's always trying to find a quick solution,
Yeah.
right? But so over and over can work for a little while, but then you always get a client situation where it doesn't work and then the whole thing breaks down. So I just found it was really important just to, I guess, what we call successive refinement, the
Yes.
pillars in DP, is just to tweak something a little bit and tweak something a little bit, tweak something a little bit until it works. And sometimes it was really small things. So like, for example, I had a tendency in sessions to give suggestions to a client on what topics I think would be good to cover based
Mm,
on, say, a previous session. But I think the inadvertent thing there was that they would get led on by what I was offering and then would be reluctant to bring up what they would prefer.
mm,
So then I would just put up a little tweak instead of me asking, oh, sorry, putting forward first what I think would be best. I instead would ask them first what
mm.
they wanted to do. And then it created a much better flow because we were working on what they wanted to work on.
Mm. As you said before, that it makes so much common sense. But what you're saying is that there was this process of trial and error. So before you
Mhm.
came to the realization of something that in the end seems rather banal, even or commonsensical. Well, maybe I should ask them first. You went through a number of iterations trying to
Mhm.
get to that point, and somehow you
Mhm.
persisted. You relied on your values
Mhm.
in order to persist.
Yeah, because I'm explaining it. It's being a bit removed from it now. It's easy to miss those finer points, but it is often just like that, as you've described, where it's just these really fine tweaks. They almost seem so insignificant at the time, where you'll doubt they'll even do anything, but over time they start to create a new system,
Mm.
basically.
And you highlight your value system about persistence because the process, as I understand DP, and as
Mm,
many folks that are applying these ideas like yourself say, results in slow
mm,
returns on a very
mhm.
large investment. So it seems quite disproportionate, the investment of time versus the outcome. Has that been your experience?
100%, 100%. I repeat it often in my post, like it's very slow. it doesn't matter. Even if you try to go fast, it's still going to be slow because then you're skipping too many steps and you're going to have to go back anyway, right? So no matter what, it's going to be slow, and that's just the nature of it. I know that can turn a lot of people off too, but at the end of the day, it's worth the reward.
Hmm.
It's the only thing I found so far that works.
And is there something in addition to sort of accepting this and your personal value of persistence that's allowed you to embrace the slow nature of the change, other than that, that's just the nature of the beast?
Mm-hmm. Oh, for sure, because you can't just lean on that because you'll just get fed up with the idea if that's what you're leaning on alone. But definitely supports. Like I've reached out to you numerous times via email.
Have I
Um,
responded?
oh, absolutely. Yeah. So, and Daryl Chow as well. He's actually coaching me at the moment as well. Yeah, my previous coach, Nathan Castle, I would lean on him a lot. And the Facebook groups, the ICCE group that we're both in, yeah, I'll put things forward often through that, just asking for people's opinions and advice. So yeah, using the support system, absolutely crucial. I don't think I'd be here without it.
If you think back to those early days in May 2021, all the way forward to when we're talking here in September 2023, what's been, or what key changes have occurred in your understanding of what DP is and what it requires from when you first started? And you may have already spoken to some of that.
I think I can actually come at it from a different angle. I remember at the time I had this expectation. I think it was just laid with a bit too much perfectionism, that I was essentially going to tackle it as an athlete would, as a musician would. And what I mean by that is just being able to put in as much as time and energy into DP as they would, right? So I was expecting myself to do like these DP sessions every day and things like this like at my desk and was just expecting to be able to put that much into it. Over time, I realized because of the nature of our work, it's just not possible to do what they do. At least if I want to have a full life, like with a healthy marriage and our cat and like maybe kids eventually and things like this, like it's
Yeah.
just not going to happen in the same way. So I've gradually just had to peel that back
Hmm.
and just not put in that same amount.
Hmm.
And find other ways of going about it, basically.
Okay. So setting some more, as you say, in a way, you have to go slow to go fast.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you have to set aside some time, but it also has to be balanced by your life, not just your work, but your relationships, etc.
That's exactly right. And I think just finding ways to in that time. So, for example, I found it's been really beneficial for me to put DP into things that I'm already doing. So, for example, on my drive to work, because that's a good 45 minutes each way, it's a really common example. And then I'll reflect because I think that's become my main DP churning system is that I'll just think and think and think and think and then refine that way. And if I have little ideas, I might bounce them off a coach or those support groups and then refine further based off that. And then make some attempts in sessions and then maybe refine based off that, but always thinking.
That's so interesting.
At
Can I
time.
ask you about that? What would you say if you had to put it in percentages, and maybe this isn't a natural translation, how much of it is head work
Oh,
versus the grunt work of just trying to muscle it out for
I
you?
think a lot of it is head work. A lot of it is head work because I guess even to tie it to another realization through the process, I was often trying to practice DP in sessions. I think I convinced myself to try and do it that way because I didn't have time outside of sessions, right? But Daryl Chow raised up the point in a coaching session that it's kind of like if you're playing a soccer game, and it's like you're trying to have the play-by-play clipboard in front of you while you're playing,
Hmm.
right? And it's just too much. There's too much cognitive load. So he taught me to just play during the sessions, just trust yourself and just go out and do what you do, and then you reflect afterwards, right? Or even beforehand and prep a
Hmm.
bit beforehand. So yeah, it's a lot of thinking work for
And
sure.
I know that Daryl is fond of saying that clinical practice is not deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is not clinical practice. The two are separate. It's interesting to hear you talk about how much time you spend refining
Mm,
your thoughts and your map that
mm,
you have that
mm,
would hopefully guide and steer your behavior in a slightly better way in the future.
mm, mm. For sure, it's really important. And I think another thing to chuck out there too is the importance I found for myself personally in writing about the journey along the way. That map and system that you're referring to, it's surprising how solid in my brain it's become. And I think writing about that is what's done that. Like even before the interview now, I was reflecting on a previous post that I'd made about finding your automatic behaviors for yourself. And I was like, I wonder if I included that really important point of reflecting on what you avoid and how you overcompensate. And I was like, oh man, I think I forgot to put it in the post. And I was going to go back and edit it. And I was like, it was there straight away. And I was like, okay, good, that was there. So it was like in my head, right?
And is the writing process for you, which I think is so cool to hear, and another big part, it's certainly been part of my life. I tell people I don't write unless I'm trying to solve a problem. And
Yeah.
it helps me pull my thoughts together. Would you describe that as a fluid? It just flows from your fingertips, or is writing about it sort of like chiseling a bit on stone? You have to think about it, pull your thoughts, or is it something else entirely? Better analogy maybe that you have.
No, I think that's fairly solid. I mean, it can be like chipping away at stones sometimes, but I find if it's that, I haven't thought about it enough, and I just need more time in that system, because I tend to find more often than not, whether it's just because it's something that just clicks with me a bit more naturally, it tends to be more that flow, right? And I think that's because I've thought about the ideas so much that once I go to put them down, they just come out
Yeah.
somewhat refined.
If somebody were listening to this interview, Jimmy, and thinking, I'm intrigued, I'd like to give this a shot, what would be your advice or recommendation for their first steps?
So I think initially reach out to some supports. So a big one is like the ICC Facebook group, sign into there and just get it out there that this is what you're thinking of doing, right? So I think it'll help yourself in just making that first step and going, okay, like I'm ready. But then it'll bring in some support as well, where people can jump on and maybe offer some advice from there, or just give you some enthusiasm that way. So I would start off with that and see if you can find a coach as well. It's basically how I started the process. Realistically, I started that very early in the piece, because that helped me in gathering feedback first and building up those enough cases, because what we say about 60 closed cases until your stats are reasonably solid. So yeah, getting coaching on feedback while I was starting out building up those cases was really helpful.
Perfect. Okay, because measurement is such a big piece, you do have to have kind of a baseline to compare to how you know you're getting better if you don't know how good you
Yeah,
are right now.
yeah.
Perfect. And actually getting some coaching around the measurement piece, whether you're doing fit with the ORS and SRS or using some other tool.
Mm.
Hey, Jimmy, thanks so much for spending the time with me this morning, talking about your deliberate practice journey. Once again, Deliberate Practice Psych right here at the bottom of the screen. And you update this page regularly, so I know people will want to come back again and again.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks.